Today I want to talk a little bit about statistics, and this video will focus on two things. Why do we need statistics, and what are statistics? But before I get into that, I am Dr. Julia Earle. I teach in the environmental science and biology programs here at Louisiana Tech. There's my email and my office. In a normal quarter, my office would be very helpful. Right now, email is your better bet because I'm not there very much due to coronavirus. So I just want to give you kind of some overview, some things to think about. And I think about teaching statistics in a very practical way. So, like, what kind of data do you have? What kind of questions do you have? And then what do you need to do with it? And how do you know if you did the test right, or what other things you need to take into consideration? So when we start with that, why do we need statistics? So I want you to pause the video and sit there and think or write down what comes to mind as to why you think we need statistics. And some of you may have already had a college course on this, and you might have a good answer. Some of you may have had a college course and still not have a good answer. The thing I think of first when I think of why we need statistics is something like this. You have this giant spreadsheet with tons and tons of numbers, and you want to know what the effect of something is. And you have so many numbers that you really can't just look at them and tell what the effect is. If you had 6 numbers in 2 categories, you can do statistics on that, but you could probably figure out if there's a difference in those numbers, or at least have a general idea just by looking at them. When you get into larger data sets, it's almost impossible to sit down and be able to tell what's going on without statistics. So statistics help you kind of summarize that. One, the big thing is variability. Because there's variation out there in the natural world. Some of you may have measured things out in the ocean or in the estuary, in the marsh, or done some experiments. Each thing you measured is not exactly the same. So there's going to be variability. Even if you had a very controlled group of something, like even on a farm, there's variability in how tall the corn grows. So it's hard to look immediately at that and know what's going on because of that. Second, sometimes research questions are complicated. We might have a treatment where we have like 4 different groups that we want to compare over time, and we might have 6 different time points. And that gets to be complicated to look at and figure out what's going on. And so the statistics can help us look at that complexity and see which variables are important. Third, it helps us to standardize methods. So if everybody does an experiment and they have their 3 data points for 2 different groups each, and they look at it and they say, oh yeah, there's definitely effect, and somebody else says, well, I don't think there's really effect. If we have a standardized method, they're all looking at it in a similar way. Whereas if we each do it individually and have our own criteria, we might have different criteria. So next up, what are statistics? You can use the word statistic in a few different ways. So in a news story, when they say, well, let's look at the statistics, they usually mean that they're looking at the averages, or they're talking about some kind of summary of data. And for that, we often look at the mean, the median, and the mode. So the mean is the same as an average, the median is the middle point, and the mode is the most frequent number. So these are summary statistics. So you can use the word that way. You can also use statistics to mean a method of handling data to ask a question. And when I say I'm going to take or teach a statistics class, then I'm usually focusing on the method of handling data to ask a question. And that's really what we want to do as researchers. We are asking a question, we've collected data. The statistic is this method we use to answer that question. Now, as researchers, we need to use what we know about biology or the environment to interpret that answer and understand what it means, but the statistics can help summarize things so to help us do that. So examples of these methods are t-tests or like regression. So I want to go over a few different statistical terms so that you just are familiar with them. One, sometimes they'll refer to a population. Now, for a biologist, we might think about a population of animals or a population of plants. But in statistics, this is just all the subjects that could be measured. So if you had different plastic pools where you manipulated things in, then each one of those pools might be a subject. If you measured a bunch of crabs, each crab might be a subject, so you might have a population of crabs or a population of pools. You might have put a quadrat down in the marsh, so like a square frame to count all the plants inside that frame. So that might be you might have a population of these quadrats in the marsh. And so a population is all these possible subjects that could be measured. A sample are the subjects actually measured. So if you wanted to know the size of crabs in the marsh outside of Lumpcon, the population would be all the crabs in that area. The sample would be the ones that you actually caught and measured. A variable is what you measured. So if we're looking at the crabs in the marsh, we might measure how large they are or weigh them to get their mass. That would be our variable. And then an observation is a single value. So an observation would be the mass of one of the crabs. And so you have a group of observations that make up your actual sample. Now, a lot of times in statistics, we talk about dependent and independent variables, and hopefully you've heard of these before. So that you're a little bit engaged here and thinking about this, why don't you pause the video and write down what you think an independent and dependent variables are. And I will give you an example, and you can see if you can tell me which one is the dependent and independent variable. So let's say we measured two different species of crabs in the marsh outside of Lumpcon, and we wanted to know how heavy they were. So we measured mass for these crabs, and we wanted to know whether the two different species are different in mass. So if we did that, which would be the dependent variable and which would be the independent variable? So write that down. So the dependent variable is what you're interested in. So it's usually what you measure. So in the case of the example I just gave you, it would be the mass of the crabs. So that would be our dependent variable. And I put y in parentheses because that's usually the thing you're going to put on the y-axis of a graph. Your independent variable is what you think might affect the dependent variable. If you're doing an experiment, the independent variable is your treatment. And so I put an X there because that's what you would put on the X-axis of your graph. And so in this case, it would be the two different species of crabs. So we think that the two different species of crabs might be different in mass, which is what we're interested in. So the mass of the crabs is the dependent variable, and the two different species are independent variable. And if we made a graph, we would want two bars, probably, and on the x-axis, you would have the names of the two different species, and on the y-axis, the height of those bars would be the average mass for all the crabs we measured of each species. We can get complicated. Some analyses have one dependent variable and more than one independent variable. So if we had species of crab and we knew if they were males or females, one variable might be species, one variable might be the sex of the crabs. And so a lot of times we phrase the research question, does the independent variable affect the dependent variable? So does the species of crab affect the mass of the crab? We can also ask questions like which independent variable affects the dependent variable the most. So maybe we measured a whole bunch of environmental variables. We might ask which environmental variable affects whatever we're measuring the most. Types of variables, and this is really important in deciding what statistical test you want to do. So we have categorical variables, and if you use SPSS, which is a program that a lot of people in the Louisiana Tech Biology Department use, you'll use it probably in your ecology class. They call categorical variables nominal variables in SPSS, but it's basically categories. So species would be a category. So you might have 5 different species of crabs. They're categories, they're not numbers. You can have ordinal variables. These are like ranks. So if you were looking at how fast frogs hopped down a runway, you might have the first frog and the second frog and the third frog. You didn't measure it. You can't have a fraction. But they do go in an order. They're like categories that go in an order. You can have counts. So you might count the number of a particular plant in a certain size area. And then you can have continuous variables, which is what most people think of. And you can have the raw measurement. So, for example, the mass of those crabs would be a raw measurement. If we're measuring it in grams, it can be in decimals, so it's a continuous variable. Or you can have what's called a derived variable, where basically you do a calculation on that variable. So you might look at the proportion of the crabs that are male. Similarly, percentage, very similar to proportion. You can do ratios, and you can also do rates. So you might measure how long something happened and how many times something happened in a certain amount of time. You can measure the rate of something occurring.